obviously always been there in women, and it's only really been recognised as a problem in, I don't know, the last 5 years or so. Okay, so a lot of the naturopaths that have been around for years and years, amazing female hormonal and fertility experts, they didn't even know about this link between histamine and estrogen. Okay, and it is a really, really fundamental thing to understand when we're thinking about women's hormones. Okay, so the interesting thing is that histamine stimulates the ovaries to produce estrogen, and that's really important because you need estrogen for ovulation, okay, and obviously to have a baby, okay. But what can happen is that if your histamine is too high, okay, and that is often coming from gut issues, you can stimulate to excessive amounts of estrogen from the ovaries, okay? And then the catch is that if your gut is not good, then you're not going to be detoxifying that estrogen effectively. And then what happens is estrogen stimulates mast cells to release histamine. Okay, so it's a really vicious cycle, okay? Estrogen increasing histamine and histamine increasing estrogen. Okay, so we need to understand that this can happen when there's high histamine, okay, which can come from gut issues, or it can come from issues with the environment, or it can come from not being able to detoxify your estrogen effectively, okay? Now, the other thing we always need to remember is that when women are going into the perimenopause phase, what will happen is their progesterone will start to drop relative to estrogen, and what you then have is relative estrogen dominance, and often women will develop histamine symptoms for the first time in that perimenopause phase, which is the years before menopause. It often starts, in your early to mid-40s, and it can last right up until you go through menopause, whereby your progesterone is just getting lower and lower and lower, okay, and estrogen gets higher and higher and higher, okay. Now, the other thing estrogen does is it downregulates the DAO enzyme, okay, and the other thing that the progesterone does, it upregulates the DAO enzyme. So what happens is this disparity between estrogen and progesterone is also causing huge issues with DAO enzyme. Okay, so what we need to also know is that estrogen gets into the brain, okay? We need it in the brain. It actually is really important because it actually increases serotonin. But what can happen, it also can increase histamine, okay? So histamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain. It's really important for wakefulness and memory and alertness, okay? But when it gets too high, okay, and it can be coming from the gut histamine getting into the brain, but it can also come from estrogen getting into the brain, and then what happens is it increases histamine in the brain. And this is often why women are getting high neurological histamine symptoms, either at ovulation when estrogen is peaking, or before menstruation when progesterone starts to drop. Okay, and this can often be headaches, migraines, as well as nausea, because nausea is actually a brain histamine issue. It can be vertigo, dizziness, and anxiety, because what's happening is the estrogen getting in the brain stimulates histamine in the brain, and that stimulates the adrenals to release adrenaline, okay? So you can feel really, really anxious, okay? So big problems for women with histamine and estrogen, and I see it in clinic all the time, okay? All the time. Okay, so what we need to think about for treating histamine and estrogen issues is how to, first of all, identify symptoms of estrogen dominance, okay? So when we're looking at women's hormones, when a woman has a regular menstrual cycle, whether that be like on the short side for her, it might be 26 days, might be her normal. The key is has it always been her normal, or was she more like a 30-day and now a 26? So if it's 26 and that's her normal, that's kind of in range. If it goes up to like 32 and that's her normal, that's in range. It's really only when there's a change that we need to think, oh, there's issues, because women have different sort of cycle length, the average being 28, but that's only the average. Okay, so when you do a blood test, a hormone test for women like that, especially the when you do FSH and LH and estrogen on day 2 or 3 of the cycle, what you'll find is 90% of the time that blood test will be in range and that they actually don't have blood hormone issues. Okay, but what can happen is they have issues with the detoxification of estrogen. So this is what I'm mainly more concerned about. Okay, so what you need to think about clinically really is signs and symptoms of estrogen dominance and progesterone deficiency. And this clinically gives you amazing information because there are some really obvious signs of estrogen dominance, and that is definitely breast tenderness, premenstrual breast tenderness. It's premenstrual bloating and fluid retention. It's premenstrual irritability and anxiety, premenstrual sadness and despair and overwhelm. Okay, you can also get sort of more cramping and pain if your estrogen is high. Okay, so remember, estrogen stimulates histamine, and histamine contracts the smooth muscle of the uterus, and that can definitely cause more period pain. Okay, so these are some obvious signs of estrogen dominance. Now, because I know so much about histamine, I'm always thinking about what are the symptoms of estrogen-driven histamine issues. Okay, so this will always also tell us that there's problems with estrogen dominance. So these are all of the histamine symptoms. So a worsening of any of the histamine symptoms, or just getting these histamine symptoms at a certain time. So you can get histamine symptoms at ovulation when estrogen is peaking, or you can get the histamine symptoms premenstrually just before your period when progesterone drops. So it can be a worsening of any of your skin issues, headaches, migraines, nausea, dizziness, insomnia. Insomnia is a big one. Okay, so insomnia often happens premenstrually, both because estrogen is relatively higher than progesterone, that's stimulating more histamine, and histamine absolutely causes insomnia. And at the same time, if your progesterone is low, that also causes insomnia because progesterone increases GABA in the brain, which is your calming neurotransmitter, which is really important for sleep. Okay, so this is why these two things, like women are having huge problems with insomnia premenstrually, and this really is prevalent in the perimenopause phase. Okay, so we're looking at estrogen dominance. So they're the signs and symptoms, okay, of estrogen dominance. Now we need to understand how we actually detoxify estrogen. Okay, so estrogen needs to go through the liver. Okay, so it goes through both phase 1 and phase 2 liver detoxification pathways. So phase 1 takes estrogen and converts it into a really, really toxic metabolite until it goes through phase 2 detoxification pathways. Okay, so phase 1 is governed by what we call these CYP enzymes, and we've got lots of CYP enzymes, that there are specific ones for estrogen. Takes estrogen, converts it into a toxic metabolite. Now, what actually supports phase 1 liver detoxification of estrogen is a supplement called indole 3-carbinol, or DIM. Okay, and what supports phase 2 liver detoxification of estrogen is methylation. Okay, so you need phase 1 to be working, and you absolutely need phase 2 to be working, because if phase 1 is working faster than phase 2, you're building up these toxic estrogen metabolites. Okay, so we need to be looking at phase 1 and phase 2 estrogen detoxification pathways. Now, the other thing that we really, really need to understand is that the gut also is a major detoxifying organ. It's not just the liver. The gut has a major role to play when it comes to detoxification. including of estrogen. So very simply, if you don't have regular daily bowel motions, you are not excreting your estrogen. Okay, and this can be a nightmare for girls with endometriosis because they often have bowel issues. And what can also happen is if the gut microbiome has got an overgrowth of bad bacteria, it can deconjugate the estrogen. Okay, so there are certain types of estrogen in the gut that release an enzyme called the beta-glucuronidase enzyme. That enzyme, when it's too high, is going to over-deconjugate your estrogen, allowing it to be more active. Okay, so you've got more active estrogen, you've got more estrogen that can actually cause estrogen dominance and all of these premenstrual symptoms and an increase in your histamine. Okay, so some of the really important things to look at for estrogen detoxification is making sure your gut is as good as possible. Also making sure your histamines are as low as possible, because you're simply going to be adding more load if your histamines are too high, your estrogens are going to be too high. Okay, and then you need to be supporting really methylation first. So you need to be looking at, do you have optimal nutrients for methylation? And these nutrients are protein, right? You need protein specifically for the sulfur-based amino acids that are contained in protein. Protein because you need the B12 from the protein. Protein because you need the zinc from the protein. You also need folate, and you need to make sure that you've got all your activated B vitamins to support methylation. Okay, so if you think your methylation's out, I have written a lot in my book about methylation and all the nutrients that we need for methylation, and sort of how the gut can hinder the absorption of these nutrients. Okay, so it's not great to just take all these methylated nutrients without ensuring that your gut is absorbing them, and it's absorption even of supplemental form, not just food, but obviously we want to get as much as we can from our food. Okay, so estrogen detoxification is a really, really important thing for women, and I can tell you I've had so many girls come to me with horrendous premenstrual dysphoric disorder, and the simple thing is that they are simply not detoxifying their estrogen properly, and this will cause horrendous mood issues like debilitating depression, debilitating anxiety, debilitating insomnia. Okay, so there's so much that can be done about PMS and premenstrual dysphoric disorder simply by working on gut and detoxification. So I wanted just to talk to you about the role that the compt enzyme has in estrogen detoxification. So a lot of people will go and get their gene report done and are interested in looking at genes and how they are impacting their health. So one of the important genes we're looking at when it comes to estrogen detoxification is the compt gene, so catechol methyltransferase. So this gene basically provides the code for the compt enzyme. The compt enzyme is the enzyme that runs phase 2 liver detoxification of estrogen via methylation. Okay, so it's called the catechol methyltransferase enzyme. Anything that's a methyltransferase needs a methyl group to work. Okay, so as I was saying before, we need to support methylation to support estrogen detoxification. Now, the compt enzyme is interesting because you can have no genetic mutation on compt, okay, and it can simply be overloaded with estrogen due to excessive environmental exposure, excessive histamine, bad gut. Your compt enzyme simply gets overloaded with estrogen and it cannot detoxify it properly. Okay, so when we're looking at genetic reports, you can't just look at a gene report and think, oh, I have a SNP on this or not. It's the environment, and what in the environment is actually hindering the process of that enzyme. So that enzyme will be hindered by having nutrient deficiencies for methylation, and it will be also hindered by an overload of estrogen. Okay, so guys, if you've got some questions, just shoot them through because I'm going to start answering some questions now. So Penny wants to know, how do you increase progesterone? So this is a really, really great question, Penny, because progesterone is such a lovely, lovely calming hormone for women. So what we need to first of all understand is that progesterone is made from cholesterol, and so is cortisol. So if your body is very stressed, okay, then your cholesterol is going to make cortisol at the expense of progesterone, because when your body is in fight and flight, it's like an emergency, okay? So the cholesterol will start being shunted into cortisol, so you're not going to make adequate progesterone. And this is a really, really big deal for women that are pushing themselves too much with work, too much with exercise, caffeine, unfortunately, women that are having way too much coffee, you're really pushing the adrenals and the production of cortisol at the expense of progesterone. Now, the other thing we need to also consider is all the nutrients that you need to make progesterone. So you need iron, you need vitamin B6, you need zinc, you need vitamin D, you need iodine. So these are really important nutrients that you need to make progesterone. And the other thing we need to remember about progesterone is that it is actually excreted from the corpus luteum that is made from ovulation. So the follicles that you use for ovulation, if they are really healthy, and what will make them healthy is not being inflamed, okay, so not having gut and histamine issues, so having healthy follicles, because the follicle, once it releases the egg, it forms the corpus luteum, and that is a tissue that secretes the progesterone, okay? So healthy follicles and healthy ovulation will make a healthy corpus luteum and excrete progesterone. But unfortunately, as you get older, into the perimenopause, there's not much you can do. We're all going to start to have a reduction in the production of progesterone due to us not ovulating as well as we did when we were younger. But there's lots of things that you can do to really support that transition. Number one, make sure your gut health is great. Number two, make sure you're not too stressed and that you're doing, like, not drinking too much coffee, keeping inflammation down, so not drinking too much alcohol and processed foods. Okay, there's lots that you can actually do to support healthy follicle quality and healthy progesterone production. So Leanne's got a really great question, which is, I feel worse when I take DIM. So indole 3-carbinol and DIM are very, very similar. I won't go into the nitty-gritty of that, but effectively, DIM supports phase 1 liver detoxification. So if you're not methylating well, right, so if your phase 2 liver detoxification pathways are not working optimally, or if your gut's not good, what will happen is you'll take DIM, it will start running phase 1 fast, and it creates toxic metabolites of estrogen until it goes through methylation. Okay, so you need to be ensuring that your methylation is working optimally before you start pushing phase 1. Okay, so if phase 2 is blocked and you're pushing phase 1, it's going to be like a bottleneck. Okay, and if your gut's not good, all it's going to be doing is this is going to be pushing estrogen back to the liver. So it's just going to have more and more and more estrogen, more and more DIM, shunting it down phase 1, building up toxic metabolites, and you can feel really unwell from it. So Leah's got a question, which is, I took Vitex for PMS, but it made my histamines worse. Now, this is a great question. So Vitex is a herb. It's also called chaste tree. Amazing herb. It helps produce progesterone. And how it helps do this is it stimulates ovulation. So that's all well and good, but if you're stimulating ovulation and your ovulation is causing your histamine issues to become worse at ovulation, which is often the case. Women can feel very anxious at ovulation. They can get headaches and migraines at ovulation. Is you're actually stimulating you're stimulating your ovulation too much, okay, increasing estrogen and histamine. And then what happens is, yes, you might be making adequate progesterone from taking the Vitex and ovulation, but if you're not detoxifying your estrogen properly, right, via phase 1 and phase 2, liver detoxification pathways and the gut, then you're simply not dealing with the estrogen side of things, and it will increase your histamine. So taking Vitex simply for PMS might not be the right thing. You might really need to be looking at methylation and how that supports estrogen detoxification. So Sonia's got a question, which is, I have MTHFR. Does this mean I have issues with estrogen detoxification? So Sonia, I really like this question because there's so much confusion about MTHFR. Okay, MTHFR is one gene in the body, okay? And just because you have a mutation on MTHFR does not mean you have any disease. It doesn't mean you have any issues, okay, just because you've got that gene mutation. Okay, we need to be considering MTHFR amongst all the other enzymes in the body, amongst your gut health, amongst your exposure to toxins and your diet. It's not just a standalone issue. Okay, so with MTHFR, if we're looking at methylation, because that's what MTHFR is involved in, is methylation, but it simply takes folate from food and converts it into methylfolate. Okay, so if your gut is not adequate, if you've got SIBO or something, you're not absorbing your folate very well, or if you're taking a lot of folic acid, which blocks the absorption of folate, then you're going to have issues with the folate component of methylation. Okay, so we need folate. We need to make sure we're converting it into methylfolate. Okay, so we need to have great gut function. We need to not be having folic acid, but we need to understand that there's all these other nutrients involved in methylation, including sulfur-based amino acids from protein and vitamin B12 and vitamin B6 and zinc. Okay, so all these other nutrients need to be in place for you to support estrogen detoxification. Okay, so Sonia, I've written a heap about this in my book around how the gut needs to be really supported for estrogen detoxification, and then we can be working on methylation, because you can't just go in with methylation first and foremost, because it's just going to push your pathways too much too quickly. Okay, so just because you got MTHFR doesn't mean you have estrogen dominance or issues with estrogen detoxification. You need to be looking at the gut, the liver, and also your exposure to too much estrogen. So Tina's got a question, which is, I have premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Can this be due to estrogen and histamine? Absolutely, Tina. So premenstrual dysphoric disorder is a really severe form of PMS. So officially in the medical texts, it is severe premenstrual syndrome, often starting from ovulation, in someone with no underlying mental health conditions. Okay, and I would also say that to have proper PMDD, you also have to not have all the other issues that can be causing normal PMS. Okay, so normal PMS can be just be caused from constipation or stress or a bad diet or having an irregular cycle. So if you fix all the other causes, often your PMDD is a lot better, or your premenstrual symptoms are improved significantly. But in women where it's not, then I have often found clinically that it is major issues with estrogen and histamine and a defect in methylation. Okay, so methylation is really important for making neurotransmitters or balancing neurotransmitters. So you need to ensure that your methylation is working optimally, because it helps create and detox your neurotransmitters. So it helps balance them. Methylation also breaks down histamine in the brain, and it also detoxifies estrogen. So if any of these things are out, then it can definitely cause issues with PMDD. Okay, so Tina, it's an issue with estrogen and histamine, as we know, because histamine increases estrogen, estrogen increases histamine. Histamine can cause massive anxiety. If it is inflammatory, so it can cause depression. And if you can't get rid of your histamine, it's causing more estrogen to build up. You can feel really, really sad with too much estrogen. Okay, so absolutely histamine and estrogen is really linked, but we also need to be thinking about methylation with PMDD, because it's usually the women that don't respond to normal treatment for PMS that have PMDD, which is often due to defects in methylation. Okay, so I've got a question from Daphne. Can menopause trigger histamine intolerance? Absolutely. So Daphne, I will definitely answer your question next week. I'm doing a whole session on perimenopause, menopause, and histamine. But what happens in menopause is that you don't have any progesterone. Okay, so progesterone is bottomed out, and progesterone increases DAO enzyme activity. Okay, and although your estrogen is lower than it was when you were menstruating, you still have estrogen. You have estrogen from being made from the adrenals and in fat tissue. Okay, so absolutely you have issues with the disparity between, so there's no progesterone. So you've basically got reduction in DAO enzyme. And often women who have pre-existing histamine issues or major gut issues that they haven't addressed, when they take hormone replacement therapy, they can, for the first time in their life, develop severe histamine symptoms from taking hormones. And I've seen it. It's a disaster, because you need the hormones, but your body can't tolerate them because it's driving up all of this histamine. Okay, so Daphne, what I suggest you do is absolutely work on your gut health to make sure that is perfect. So make sure you don't have any bad bacteria in the large bowel, you don't have SIBO, you don't have problems with oxalates, you have daily bowel motions, to make sure that you're detoxifying your histamine, and then that can reduce the load, and hopefully then you'll be able to take some hormones. So I've got a question from Dr. I can't read your last name, I think Alvarez. Can endometriosis be a cause of low homocysteine? Absolutely. Dr. Alvarez, yeah. So often when I test homocysteine in women with endometriosis, it's low. And I think it's just because endometriosis is such an inflammatory condition. And it's not just an inflammatory condition of the reproductive organs. It's an inflammatory condition of the gut as well, because the endometrial tissue gets into the bowel, it gets up into the small bowel, and absolutely disrupts the gut, causes SIBO, large bowel dysbiosis, huge problems with histamine, so huge problems with gut inflammation that can drive down homocysteine, and simply being an inflammatory condition on its own will absolutely drive down homocysteine. Okay, so it's not because they've got MTHFR, it's just because they have an inflammatory condition that is drawing down their homocysteine. So it's pulling the homocysteine down the CBS pathway to support two pathways, right? It's supporting the sulfation pathway, because sulfation is also involved in estrogen detoxification, and it's really trying to make glutathione to sequester all the free radicals that occur in endometriosis. So absolutely, women with endometriosis will often have low homocysteine. So I hope that makes sense. So it's not if they've got MTHFR or not, it's if the fact that they've got this inflammatory condition driving down their homocysteine. Okay, so Bianca's got a great question, which is, how can you increase the compt enzyme? So good question. Okay, so how we support compt is we support methylation, because the compt enzyme needs a methyl group to work. Okay, so what we do is we look at gut health. Are you absorbing your protein? Do you have adequate sulfur-based amino acids? Do you have adequate B12? Do you have adequate folate? Okay, what's your homocysteine levels, high or low? If it's high, we need to get it down. If it's low, we need to get it up. I've written about all of this in my book, guys, high and low homocysteine. So we support methylation, so we have enough methyls for compt to work, and we also work on gut to detoxify estrogen. We also work on histamine to get histamine down, because remember, histamine is going to increase estrogen, and that compt enzyme is simply overloaded with too much estrogen. Okay, so support gut, reduce your histamines, support estrogen detoxification, and support methylation is going to help support compt. So Caitlin has a question, which is, what is the best diet for estrogen dominance? Okay, so this is a good question, because it's not going to be the same diet for everyone. Okay, so we need to understand what is driving your estrogen dominance. So if it is issues with the gut and SIBO, for instance, right, then if your SIBO is driving your constipation or your histamine issues, then you need to be following a low FODMAP diet and a low resistance starch diet to reduce your SIBO, which will help with estrogen. Okay, if you don't have SIBO and you have issues with oxalates that are driving issues with histamine, then you need to be on a low oxalate diet. Okay, so if you don't have any of those issues but you're just chronically constipated, maybe it's simply gluten, because gluten can absolutely cause chronic constipation. Maybe you're not eating enough fiber, okay, because we need a lot of fiber for bowel motions. And guys, honestly, I can't tell you how many women they just don't drink enough water. Like, it's so interesting. They'll come with all these, having done all these incredible tests and had colonoscopies, endoscopies, and it's simply like they just drink 1 glass of water a day. Okay, so drinking lots of water and making sure your bowels are good and healthy is going to help with estrogen detoxification. So Danny has a question, and that is, how do I bring down my high copper? So copper is interesting, because copper is often tested with zinc, because zinc and copper compete for absorption in the body. And zinc is so essential for everything. It is a cofactor for all the neurotransmitters. It makes serotonin and dopamine, GABA. It makes hydrochloric acid. You need zinc to make hydrochloric acid. It heals the tight junctions in the gut, so it heals a leaky gut. It's essential for mood. It's essential for immune system. It's essential for methylation. It's a cofactor in a few of the enzymes in methylation. It does so many things, zinc. So what happens if your copper is high? Your zinc can't get in the cell, and you become deficient in zinc. Okay, so what we need to understand is, you can't, if your copper's high, and your zinc's low, you can't just take zinc. It's not actually going to balance it out. What we need to understand is what's driving high copper, and estrogen is a major cause of high copper. If you see a woman on HRT or the pill, her copper will be high, really high. It could be like 30. Okay, that's because these synthetic estrogens absolutely drive up copper to a really high level. The other thing, simply a woman with estrogen dominance, okay, they're not on the pill, they're not on HRT, they've just got big issues with estrogen detoxification. Their copper might be like 20, 21, 22, something like that, okay, and their zinc's only 10. So you can't just take zinc, you need to bring down the copper, so you need to work on estrogen detoxification to reduce copper. Now, copper is also driven simply from inflammation as well. And if you're a menstruating woman and you've got inflammation, then it's a double whammy, because if you've got inflammation, you very likely have high histamine, and then you very likely have estrogen dominance driven from all the inflammation and histamine. Okay, so just simply taking zinc to try and balance out copper is not right. You need to bring it down with estrogen detoxification. So Felicity's question. This is a good one. This is about endometriosis as well. So, does endometriosis cause histamine intolerance? And I would say, Felicity, that in the majority of my patients that I see with endometriosis, the answer is absolutely yes. So with endometriosis, what we've got to understand, it's not just a gynecological hormone problem, it is an inflammatory condition that not only affects the reproductive organs, it affects the gut and it absolutely affects the bladder. Okay, so what is happening is the endometrial tissue and the bowel, and it's moving outside the uterus, and it's getting into the bowel and the bladder and into the gut. Okay, so one of the major causes of SIBO is actually endometriosis. So endometriosis causes adhesions, and if you think about the bowel, it's like a sausage. If you get adhesions and kinks in the bowel, what's going to happen is you are not able to sweep out undigested food and bacteria, which is going to be a breeding ground for SIBO. Okay, so when that happens, you develop a lot of histamine because SIBO is a major driver of histamine. Okay, and then the disaster in all of this is that the histamine is causing huge problems with the increasing amount of estrogen. And the last thing you need as a woman with endometriosis is more estrogen, because you've got more endometrial tissue, so the estrogen is going to plump up the endometrial tissue, causing more disruption and often more pain, because the endometrial tissue grows with estrogen, so it's going to push more on nerves and cause more pain. Okay, so most women with endometriosis do have issues with histamine. So I really, really suggest with endometriosis is, one of the main things you need to start looking at doing is testing for SIBO, doing stool testing, making sure that the gut microbiome is balanced, it's not releasing histamine. So you've got to treat the SIBO, treat any bad bacteria in the large bowel. Often women with endometriosis need a lot of support with digestive enzymes, because if they're not sweeping out the undigested food because they've got kinks in the bowel, you need to make sure at least that you're really, really breaking down your food as much as possible. Okay, so hydrochloric acid and pancreatic enzymes are really, really important for making sure you break down your food so that it's going to be easier to sweep out. Often this helps a lot with pain. So I've got a lot of endometriosis patients that, interestingly, their pain symptoms are helped significantly by taking digestive enzymes every day of the month. It really helps with making sure that they don't build up undigested food, which is going to rot and ferment and cause more inflammation, which definitely just causes more pain in the body. Okay, so definitely huge link between endometriosis and histamine. So it's not just the estrogen component, it's the fact that endometriosis causes huge gut issues, and the gut issues are going to drive problems with histamine, and then the gut issues are going to drive problems with estrogen detoxification. So you've got that really vicious cycle between estrogen detoxification problems, more histamine, then more histamine, more estrogen. So it's a really vicious cycle that goes round and round and round. All right, guys, so that's it for estrogen and histamine today. But next week or next Tuesday, I'm going to talk more about perimenopause, menopause issues that we see with patients with histamine intolerance. So thanks for joining me, guys. Have a great Saturday. Bye.